Hello, good morning everyone. In this very pleasant and very nice winter morning, and thanks to everyone who's managed to wake up and come for our session. I have with me here, as you can see, three very special, very celebrated women, and I will just introduce them. Tishani Doshi, very celebrated poet. Urvashi Butalia, who doesn't need an introduction, she's an institution herself. She's the feminist publisher and scholar. And Shreya Sen-Handley, who is a long-time journalist, and she has authored a book recently, last year is it? Yeah, called Memoirs of My Body. And which is a very powerful and a very intense and a special book, which we'll talk about when we begin the session. So without much delay, let's start with #MeToo. So this is a topic that's not very easy to engage with because it's nuanced and it's controversial and it's delicate, and there are many sides and many threads to the argument, which we all hope to bring up in the course of today's discussion. And I think just to kickstart this discussion, I would like to request Shreya to read out a passage from her book.
Okay. I'd just like to say that though this is a very serious topic, not everything I read or say has to be taken seriously. So, eventually, I found a room with a kitchenette and a shared terrace in Chittaranjan Park, the stronghold of the domiciled Bengalis of Delhi. While I looked around my new room, the reception committee of the landlord and his grown sons sized me up. From the dark interior of the house came a quavering female voice announcing the imminent dishing up of March Bhat, and the younger men scuttled out. My portly landlord, in a hurry to leave as well, handed over a key with a brief, very brief, with much waiting, lecture on the fine morals of the Bengali woman. I could have whooped with joy. I finally had a place to stay, and it wasn't too bad. But an obstacle was waiting just round the corner, or rather, like with the last place, it was the absence of one that was a problem. There appeared to be neither lock nor handle on my side of an interconnecting door. So I asked very nicely about arrangements to secure it from my side, and the sweet, syrupy miasma that had hung in the air suddenly turned to frost. Kano lagbe? Asked the patriarch testily. For security and privacy, I stated, at which he drew himself to his full 5 feet and said, Apni ki amade chor na molester dakchen? And without further ado, including doing anything about the door, he stormed out. And I realized why the last girl who'd roomed there had moved in such a hurry. Had anything happened, or had the implications of a door without a lock spooked her as it did me? I had paid a deposit, however, and had nowhere else to go that night, but I had a plan. In the room was a cupboard that looked flimsy enough for me to push across the floor, but not so rickety it could be knocked over without ruckus or effort in the dead of night. It took me nearly an hour to move it, but I did get some sleep that night. I woke, however, to golmal, or 3 very golmals kicking up a fuss. The Bengali Bhadralok had discovered they'd been outfoxed by a pint-sized Bengali woman and weren't happy. I was sent on my way with an outraged bong flea in my ear and without my deposit. I wish I'd known then about the handbook all these Delhi landlords owned, and not just landlords, but a great many men around the world. It tells them all they need to know about women. Ain't much to us, you know. The most thumbed bit is frequently the section on feminine harlotry called the slut scale. There isn't such a book, of course, but S for slatternly, L for loose, U for uninhibited, and T for tramps. It puts forward the age-old and still firmly held belief that most women are just waiting to be invaded by man's many icky, sticky, and often stubby protrusions. There are, of course, degrees of decadence amongst us, but we do all figure somewhere on the global slapper index, from the totally innocent 5-year-old to the 85-year-old grandma who would rather find her teeth than a man, we've all managed to lure some hapless man to his doom with our uncontrollable, coming out of our years sexuality. Indian politician Vijay Varghya wisely warns women, your provocative dresses are responsible for all deviations in society. While Iranian cleric Siddiqui thunders, many women who don't dress modestly lead young men astray and spread adultery in society, which increases earthquakes. And check this pearl out from American media mogul Pat Robertson. Feminism encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. This can't go on. No further man, beast, deeply flawed economic system, or slippy, slidey tectonic plate should be endangered by our earth-shatteringly sluttish ways. But just how slutty are you? I think you need to read a bit more to find out. So,
thank you, Shreya.
thank you.
Yeah. Clearly, you caught a glimpse of what this book promises to be. I'm reading it currently. I haven't read all portions, but whatever I've read is really, really, I just go, just go ahead and read it. I'd ask you to do that. It's really intense. And it's really, really something that every woman will identify with. And just on that note, Shreya, just like from the passage you read out was sort of so coated with humor, and so is your entire book. It's tongue-in-cheek, it's sarcastic, it's biting. And I have a very good defense against all those who say feminists can't be humorous. Go read this book, and you'll know that they can crack jokes and be very, very, biting. So, can you just talk a little bit about how you used, whether you used humor specifically as a tool for this book, or whether it's just who you are, and how it was about writing about such intimate experiences? It's because it is about, at the end of the day, about the journey of a woman through the lens of her body. So, yeah, what was going on?
Sorry, I'm not used to the mic. Okay. Well, I think humor is a tool for life. I mean, it's a coping mechanism for all of us. And so all the injustices and indignities and everything, most of us will deal with it with humor, because otherwise it's so overwhelming and it's so much a part of all of our lives on a daily basis. It would be impossible to carry on if we weren't dealing with it with humor. I mean, besides that, it's my nature to sort of, I'm kind of a stand-up comic, and that sort of gets me through life and then helps me with my children. It gives me brownie points with them as well. So it's who I am. But I think it also makes what I'm saying palatable, and it goes down better. And I believe, I mean, this is a book for men as well. A lot of men have read it and liked it. I wonder if I'd been thundering from the pulpit rather than making it funny and making it go down with a sugar-coated pill, really, whether it would have gone down as well with them. So that's why I've used humor.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I kept wondering while reading this book. How does one write about such stuff? There are so many moments in that book which I would identify with, and many others, but would I really write them down? So yeah, the jokes make it easier. And so this book is actually, in a sense, a celebration of talking about your abuse, your body, the pains and scars, which pretty much brings us to our topic today, Me Too, where across the world women come together and they talk about victimhood and abuse and survival stories. And just to sort of dwell on this point, I'd like to ask Urvashi on this, since you've been so connected with feminist publishing and you've been so instrumental in always bringing out the stories of women from a very long time back, about women's stories by women, for women. So how does it feel like, when whatever you started long back has sort of found a new way of expressing itself on the social media? If you could sort of connect the two.
Well, I think what we are seeing today is the articulation of many, many more voices inside the feminist movement, and also women who may not necessarily identify themselves as feminists. So I think the beginnings of breaking that silence are what we are looking at. I don't think that, I mean, we were only one of the actors in looking at the need to foreground women's voices many years ago when we started our publishing house. But had it not been for the women's movement in India, which was very dynamic and which was raising all these issues, I don't think we would have been able to survive. You know, there is a way in which that politics on the ground gives rise to different ways of articulating the things that women are thinking about. So I think that's important, but at the same time, I think what the Me Too and the Him Too campaigns show us is that despite this, the beginnings of this opening up of different kinds of voices coming into the public arena, there is still so much that remains unaddressed, there's still so much silence, and it is still so difficult to break. As you see in the young women naming a whole bunch of professors, I mean, what are the possibilities for young students who are being taught by extremely powerful, extremely charismatic, and highly intelligent and intellectual male teachers to be able to speak about that other aspect of that relationship, which is really not sanctioned, really not allowed, and so on, but which seems to be really pervasive. So I think we have to recognize both things, that yes, the silence is beginning to be broken, and yet it is very deep and extremely wide and really difficult to articulate what goes on because there is no vocabulary, there are no words, there is no enabling environment in which the words you say can be received, which is why humor is one way of getting them out there, and all of that needs to change.
Yeah, exactly. So on that note, Tishani, we'll come back to the list and we'll discuss it and all the implications that it has. What would be your take on talking about abuse or, you know, sort of discouraging the culture of silence, and how does your poetry or how do you as a person express yourself, and how do you think it finds a way out?
Put it on. Hi, can you hear me? I think that, you know, as a poet, the concerns are many, and so with this new book, Girls Are Coming Out of the Woods, definitely there are many poems that deal with gender violence. This is something that I've approached both as a spectator, as a woman who lives in this country and reads the newspapers and is horrified, but also in a personal way of having also lost a friend who was raped and murdered, and who has known stories. You know, the way that stories move is through different people, and so they arrive very close to you. And I think that, so as a poet, definitely, the experience of the woman, the experience of the female, both in its most powerful aspect, but also in this aspect of the fact that we have been, that there's so much abuse that is going on, and the scale of it is so large. And finally, there is a sense now, I think, of understanding the extent of it, you know. And I feel someone who, you know, in the last, say, 30, 40 years of having been around, it's changed radically in terms of this question of silence, in terms of what is allowed to be spoken about. And I feel like now we're living in a time where it is complicated, as Urvashi said. We are going to be questioned about things, we are going to be judged for what we say, but there is a climate where we can speak. And I think it's also very important to note that it is happening because of a chorus of voices. It's not one person getting up to tell one story, because actually women have been trying to do that for a very long time, and they either got burnt at the stake or something, you know. But now it's this sense of, you have 100 women, you have 50 women, you have 20 women, you have 30 women. they're saying this man did this to us. And then there's a sense of that story has power, it has truth, it has a kind of momentum to actually change things, change the idea that as a powerful man you can do anything, but also change legislation. So I mean, these are all the things that are going through my head, but I absolutely agree that it's so complicated because we are going through this movement now, and it is a kind of revolution, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, powerful men are being removed from jobs, and powerful men in positions of power are making statements about the importance of addressing this hidden issue. So I think that's a change that we really have to mark.
And I know many people who, men particularly, who are saying, you know, I'm worried. I wonder whether I have done something to offend someone. And I think this is not about monsters. It's not about, I mean, there are monsters. There are certifiable monsters. But I think it's also about our interactions. And it's about sexuality, which in this country is, you know, it's in a very difficult place in terms of expression, in terms of freedom, in terms of how we interact between genders. And so we have a long, long way to go.
Yeah, it's about growing up and what kind of atmosphere you've grown up in and how it sort of informs you. Yeah. And there are so many people who, after this, which you were talking about, the men who are anxious, and that's actually generated another hashtag called Not All Men, which is sort of a response to Me Too in many ways. So yeah, and yeah, you were saying.
No, I was just saying that's very pertinent because it's about how we've all grown up. It's the society and how it's structured, so that not all men, I don't know if that's actually true, perhaps all men are guilty of low-level sexual harassment, not because they're meant to do any harm, but because of the way we've all been brought up. Because, you know, there are little things that we all do that we're told it's okay to do that might change in the future. I mean, I told my husband, who's the nicest man I know, I mean, my dad's out there, but my husband is the nicest man I know. And I said to him, I bet even you are guilty of sexual harassment. And he said, it's very possible, because some of the things we say in passing...
We don't even know what we're saying.
Yeah, exactly. It's the way we've all been brought up, and we just need to break out of that mold. And
it's about the structure, that's the monster, because that sort of conditions your behavior in many ways. Precisely. Of course, you can break out of it, and of course, it depends on how you engage with it.
Yes.
But yeah. Yeah, so before we sort of start critiquing the Me Too, let's just talk about what Tishani said about the sheer magnitude of what's happening. And when we talk about Me Too, what we immediately, I think, visualize is a hashtag, which sort of signifies a lot, which says that this exists in multitudes, which sort of talks about a sense of solidarity, because hashtags are there for everything. You go on Instagram and there's a hashtag for food porn too, and then you go and you say, okay, this person likes the same food that I like. So just extending that argument to the story of abuse, when you go and you look for the Me Too hashtags, you will find so many similar experiences, similar and different. There are some that you will really, really shock you, and you'll say, okay, this could also happen to a person. And there are some which you will identify with. Okay, so this happened to me at the metro yesterday. Something like that. So that's what a hashtag, I think, has come to. It sort of brings us together. And even in, say, circles which are slightly more empowered than the rest, like the more educated people, there are people who have realize the magnitude of it, which speaks for a lot, because even in this kind of circle, people didn't know the magnitude. I've had people come up to me and say, you know, I didn't know. Facebook informed me, which of course brings us to the next question about Facebook and its access and who's actually talking and who's not being able to talk. But yeah, just to sort of talk about the positives, if all of you.
Actually, I was going to say something negative, but no, in the sense that while there is a general consensus that there is this magnitude, there's also inevitably been this backlash now. When you have someone like Catherine Deneuve saying things like, you know, men should be allowed to pester, this idea that it's asking about how we must define consent. And are we going to remove sex entirely? Are we going to become these sort of signing a contract before, you know? And I think that's really unfair because I think most people know the difference between something that is consensual and something that is not, something that is within a certain power structure and allowed and something that is not. And I feel that it's detrimental to what's begun, and it's inevitable because now you have 100 think pieces being written by so many people saying, oh, it was great, but now don't get carried away, ladies. Like, you know, you've had your moment and let's not, you know, go too far. Yeah. I feel differently.
Don't be a feminazi. Stick to being a feminist.
No, and just using language like witch hunt. Witch hunt. You know, which is so wrong, because actually women were burned in the hundreds precisely because they stuck out a little bit out of the ordinary. So, and they were killed for that. So to use that against, you know, for men, it's a little bit rich. And so I feel like those are some of the problems that I am thinking about, like, you know, people asking about this list that you were talking about what happens if there's a false accusation, what is the due process, Aziz Ansari, whatever, you know, there's like 110 things that we have to say, well, how do we equate, how do we judge different things, how do we have a Harvey Weinstein, or we have a Bill Cosby, or we have a, you know, and then of course taking it out of the realm of even power and Hollywood and politics and people who have real power versus, you know, sexual abuse that's happening in sort of ordinary and non-powerful people.
One thing that struck me is that the onus is being put back on us constantly. So, you know, did she say it at the right time? Did she, you know, was she dressed right? Even with all the things that are coming out now, the question that keeps getting asked is, but, you know, did she make it clear? Is it not her fault if she didn't make it clear? How can she complain about it afterwards? Why was it a feeble no?
And there are still judgments like Muhammad Farooqi's which come up with, which sort of resonate with that sentiment of larki ki na mein bhi haan hoti hai. So there's no in.
Feeble no. Yeah.
So
but, you know, I think if I may step in here, I think in order to begin to understand what's happening, we also have to look at it a little bit historically. And we have to look at what's changed. And I think the first thing that somebody of my generation would do is to look at ourselves. So we grew up in an atmosphere where even though I might have been schooled in the feminist movement and cut my political teeth over there, but we internalized the patriarchal relationships that happen inside families and inside public spaces. So a lot of the sexual abuse, molestation, assault, whatever that we were subjected to, we didn't notice, we took as natural. We were tolerant of it, and often we were silent about it. The younger generation has not been brought up in that way, and they have a whole history behind them which tells them that this is not acceptable. I think that's changed. I think the nature of the workplace has changed. So even though workforce participation rates are down, but women are there in the public space in different kinds of jobs, which transforms the nature of interaction inside professional spaces, which is very threatening to people who have always occupied those spaces as if they were theirs. You see women, they bring in color, they bring in change, they bring in all sorts of things. And which transforms the nature of interaction there because power equations also begin to change. So you see much more articulation of the inequalities which are endemic inside this whole sexual harassment thing. And I think that there is a way in which people are not willing to tolerate that anymore. And then when you look at something like the Jyoti Singh Pandey case, that has also opened up a space. But Pia, I would disagree with you a little bit on the whole business of the hashtag, because I think the hashtag business, important, quick, and widespread, is still very, very limited. It's really only those people who have access to the net and who are, by and large, English speaking. It's not as if these issues have not been articulated, so I'm not sure if your generation remembers, but the Kamaljeet Deol case, where a high-level police officer in Punjab accused the top gun police officer of slapping her bottom in a party, And because this Top Gun police officer was the one who is believed to have controlled, I'm using the word within quotes, militancy in the Punjab, therefore her complaint was seen to be frivolous, because if you are being the nationalist and ridding the country of militancy, then what is this little sexual peccadillo? Isko to chodo, let it be. So there are women like that who have spoken out. There are women like Bhavri who spoke out, and who is the woman who is responsible for giving us the Sexual Harassment Act. And we should always remember poor Dalit from Rajasthan, all of that. So in a sense, there is a different level. This hashtag thing is okay. It's people like us. I don't think it's the important thing. I think there's much more going on. And I think we have to note that as well.
Yeah, which is exactly what I think what you addressed is one of the main criticisms of the movement, where people have said that this movement, particularly #MeToo, is limited to people who only have internet access. And there is this question about what exactly happens after you speak out. Because it's a very important criticism, because there have been cases where crimes have been reported and then nothing has happened. There is no way to address it. There is no way for recovery. So what exactly happens? I mean, articulation is important, but is it stopping there, or is something happening? So
sometimes it's enough for the person, because
exactly,
it's so difficult to
question
live with the silence. You remember the young legal intern who spoke out on her blog, and who said for her that was the important thing, to be able to articulate it. She didn't want to take it further. And I think we also have to respect that choice, that sometimes just giving it a voice is enough of a step. Sometimes you want to go beyond that.
Sure.
Yeah, I just want to say that the Me Too was started by Tarana Burke, African-American woman, in 2006. And it only sort of is in its current form now because a Hollywood actress, Alyssa Milano, just said if you have been a victim, then you can put... And then it's sort of grown a lot. And I think that's a wonderful thing that the internet can do, is to create a sense of solidarity in a very universal way across the world. But Urvashi is absolutely right that it's not... doesn't speak for everyone and doesn't allow everybody to tell their stories. And the really most important thing is about being able to say it, to have that venue to say it, to know that you will be treated with a kind of respect if you say it, and that you just feel some sense of relief, I think, because it's like holding a secret for a long time. And I was just reading about this Olympic gymnast doctor, Larry, I forget the last name. There's like 140 American women gymnasts who he abused. Yeah, like 100, and for years and years and years they had been complaining and saying things and nothing happened. And now they are talking to him in the courtroom. They want to address him directly. And I think that's something very powerful, because what happens in that situation is that you are being squashed. Your voice has literally been taken from you because of so many fears that if you tell, you are shamed. If you tell, no one will believe you. So to be able to, we are now living in that moment when actually women can speak directly. And I think that's really, really uplifting in a way and powerful.
Also because you're not alone then.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Again, it comes to that idea of the solidarity, and that you are saying, we are together. And in fact, it shows a kind of predatory behavior, because there are so many women who have suffered this.
And I think not just limited to sexual abuse, but in India, as a woman, for many women, you're not allowed to define who you are. You're somebody's daughter, somebody's wife, somebody's mother. So being able to tell your own story and not having a label slapped on you, whether even if it's a label of, oh, you're a slut because this happened to you, or you're the shamed woman, or you're brave heart, but they put tags on you and you're not allowed to tell your own story. So to that extent, it's important. But if I might just quickly, because I've got my journalistic hat on. So, only 60% of India has access to the internet. And of that whole, only 29% of women have access at all in any shape or form. Last year, I think 40,000 Dalits had crimes committed against them, and a great many of these were rapes. So that they're being left out is I consider the biggest problem of the Me Too movement. But perhaps there'll be
Is the
a
figure
movement
as high
movement.
as 60%? I thought it was much, much less.
I was surprised by
Yeah.
that figure, but I checked it out on the internet a couple of
Yeah.
times. I could be wrong. I could be wrong. So,
Yeah, actually 60% is a lot.
sounds like a
for-
lot, doesn't it?
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, of course, dwelling on what you said, it is one of the important critiques that the movement was initially started by women of color, Tarana Burke, and then it was sort of appropriated into this sphere of Hollywood circuit where it sort of got limited to, white famous women. And I don't know if we can extend that logic to India, but then again, as we can, as we always say, that articulation helps and that sense of solidarity brings us together in some sense or the other. Although we don't know what are the voices that are still silent and what are the voices that these specific tools are silencing. Because once you know that they are doing it, sometimes you're scared if you belong to the other side. You know that you don't have that power.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and also one of the important critiques which I'd like all of you to sort of speak on is the fact that it has sort of left out the LGBTQ community, and is it a movement that's specifically limited to women speaking out, or is that, or are these baby steps, or,
When you say left out, you mean what? I'm not entirely clear.
I
so-
mean, we haven't had the community speak up as a community. We've only had women who've identified themselves as being a woman and not queer women or trans women. Have they at all joined the movement? Because
You mean the Me Too movement?
yes.
So I think, I'm not sure, I don't know how one can respond to that, because I think there is nobody who is activating a list that comprises certain kinds of people. It's not an orchestrated sort of campaign. It is really people who want to speak. And Raya Sarkar's list, for example, because it's closer to home, has made the space. I don't think that if somebody wanted to express something about an LGBTQ relationship or somebody from within that they wouldn't have space on that. So I don't think it's like that, but I think that there are ways in which different people find it possible to speak at a certain time, necessary to speak at a certain time. And there is a willingness to speak at a certain time, and that has to do with the opposite of it. That is the possibility of being heard. So, I mean, when somebody like Spivak talks about can the subaltern speak, I think the second half of that is there anybody to listen? And the speech can only make sense if you're listening. So I think it is a question of when you feel ready to speak, and is there a space where you can speak, and is there a space where you can be heard? All of those things. And possibly because this list is just, these were the first few articulations that came about in the public space. They came from what you might call, I don't know, within quotes, the mainstream of the movement. I mean, I'm not really sure that that is a question that can be easily asked, has it left out X or Y voices? Why would it? Who is doing the leaving out?
No, I just suddenly recalled that the Kevin Spacey thing, it was a man who accused Kevin Spacey of sexual harassment. And so I think there are voices that are not of heterosexual mainstream women, but probably less, because that's always the case in whatever movement. There's more people from the mainstream, and the people who feel marginalized sort of join in later or get pushed to the sides a little bit. So I think it's just about encouraging everybody to join in, and hopefully, and that extends to all the people we've been talking about, whether it's women who don't have access to the internet, or whether it's about all these other communities as well who should have that right to speak up.
Yeah. So just going back to the list, how would you look at the list in the sense of being a tool for addressing this kind of sexual abuse at not just workplace, but in academia, which has been a space where people have always spoken out against this kind of thing. And just to sort of look at it slightly critically, but also sort of look at it in an empowering way, do you think this makes the classroom or academia a more anxious space? Or do you think it's been very long and the power dynamics are so deep-rooted that this was the time to be heard and to speak up?
I don't know. I think, the list, as far as I know, was published on Facebook, which is not really any kind of great judicial system. It's just putting some names out there, and I think it creates a kind of discussion and various talking points. I would be curious to know, for someone who knows more about it, about whether it has actually led to a change in legislature within academia, because I think what the consensus is that the current systems are failing many young students, whether they be women or men, and I think that those always need to be rejuvenated and rethought of, because you can't be that you arrive at a kind of high position of power like this policeman or a tenured professor, where you are then untouchable. And I think what the list exposed was that there was a large number of people who had grievances. So I don't know, because I don't work within the Indian academic construct, so I don't know what those current rules are and whether this has changed anything. Would you know, Urvashi?
I don't know if it's changed anything, but I think certainly there's a lot of questions that have been raised. And I think they have to do with a whole lot of things. So when we talk of that particular list of Indian academics, largely in the US academy, some local here, and name them anonymously, I think there's a lot of questions, and I think often we're asking the wrong kind of questions. So, for example, one of the questions that has been has troubled the feminist movement in this country for the longest time is the efficacy of existing systems of law to deal with issues of the personal and the political, and the steps that often women have taken, which might be considered extra-legal steps, taking the law into their own hands when they have been so enraged and so affronted and so frustrated and so fed up at not getting anything from the law that they have resorted to this kind of solution. And as feminists, I have to say, often when that has happened, we have celebrated. So when Pappu Yadav was lynched in jail, we were all delighted, But at the same time, when somebody like Sampath Pal starts the Gulabi gang and they go and beat up people, etc., then we ask, is it right to take the law into your own hands? Because all of us engaging with the law as feminists are also troubled by what the law can accommodate of the nuance of personal relationships and what it leaves out. So that's one issue I think that this thing gives rise to. For me, the other thing that I often say is one of the things it's thrown light on the entire campaign, the campaign abroad, the campaign in India, is how widespread the problem is. And it surprises me that more men particularly have not gotten up and said, okay, no matter the rights and wrongs of this list, but we realize that this is an amazingly deep and wide problem, and we express our solidarity with women, and we will look at our own behavior. I mean, they did this with HIV/AIDS, they did this with Section 377, but where this is concerned, they're all lurking and hiding because they're scared that tomorrow my name might be out there. So I don't know, I have to be very careful. And they don't know what to say about the rights and wrongs of that list, And I think it also raises this issue that of course, we have fought and we have actually gained inside the legal system steps or successes, I mean, the putting in place of the Sexual Harassment Act, we might have problems with the act, but nevertheless, it is a really important step. And if you look at it at over a 25-year-old period from the time that Bhavari's rape happened to today, when the entire corporate world is talking about gender sensitization in the workplace, it's a big, important thing, and you can't really knock it. You can't knock it and say, okay, it's failing us and we're going to do this. So in a sense, there's lots of issues it gives rise to. I'm not making any value judgments, but I'm saying that all of this is something that we need to understand in order to understand what's happening around us. It's not easy, it's confusing for all of us, but it's really significant.
I think it's interesting the point you made about not enough men having got up and said, you know, we're with you on this. I've actually come across quite a few who identified themselves as feminists who are now kind of scared and saying, ooh, I don't know where this is going. And so there's a feeling in some quarters that, hey, we need to back off now because we might be losing our allies. But I think that's the opposite of what we need to do. This is a brilliant reality check. And if there are men who are kind of thinking, well, were we ever really feminists then? That's exactly what we need to happen.
And I think also, it's also this thing of male, relationships between men and women, because especially if you're talking of the workplace, you spend the better part of your life in the workspace. And I think the fear in everyone's minds, male and female, is if you're going to regulate it so much that every step has to be watched, then what happens to the natural, within quotes, natural processes of attraction and things. Exactly. So there's also that. And feminists are also thinking about that. Yeah. I mean, we're not all hyenas.
There's also a question of the list, where it's just a name without any, it's not a paragraph or it's not even a sentence, it's just a name without a story to it. That makes it perhaps a little bit problematic. Of course, these are issues that we all need to address, as you said. So I think we're running out of time and we need to take audience questions now. But before that, briefly, Tishani, could we just hear a poem from you on the...
Sure. I thought I would read the title poem because it seems to be the one that fits most for this session. And it's called Girls Are Coming Out of the Woods. I wrote it actually after Jyoti Singh was raped in 2012. So yeah, here goes. Sorry. I know it anyway. Girls are coming out of the woods, wrapped in cloaks and hoods, carrying iron bars and candles and a multitude of scars collected on acres of premature grass and city buses, in temples and bars. Girls are coming out of the woods with panties tied around their lips, making such a noise it's impossible to hear. Is the world speaking too? Is it really asking, what does it mean to give someone a proper resting? Girls are coming out of the woods, lifting their broken legs high, leaking secrets from unfastened thighs. All the lies whispered by strangers and swimming coaches and uncles, especially uncles who said spreading would be light and easy, who put bullets in their chests and fed their pretty faces to fire, who sucked the mud clean off their ribs and decorated their coffins with briar. Girls are coming out of the woods, clearing a ground to scatter their stories. Even those girls found naked in ditches and wells, those forgotten in neglected attics and buried in riverbeds like sediments from a different century. They've crawled their way out from behind the curtains of childhood, the silver-pink weight of their bodies pushing against water, against the sad, feathered tarnish of remembrance. Girls are coming out of the woods, the way birds arrive at morning windows, pecking and humming, until all you can hear is the smash of their minuscule hearts against glass, the bright desperation of sound, bashing, disappearing. Girls are coming out of the woods. They're coming. They're coming.
That's wonderful, and we'll definitely need some time before we react to that, I think. So quickly moving on to it's now open to the audience for any questions.
I don't have a question, I just have some information to give. Is that okay?
Sure.
Well, one is I don't think we should really say that all the women who complained, as far as Me Too goes, or put their names on the list, were straight women. I think that's not a right conclusion to come to. And definitely, I mean, there was a history professor, very well-known academic, and who was named on that list. And after he was named, some of the women who talked about him harassing them were queer women, and they talked on other people's Facebook walls. So limited though the list may be, the controversies it may have caused, it's really enabled a lot of women to come out, which is not to take away the various criticisms about it. About changes in the university space, there are times when, people have always looked up to the university authorities to make changes. But in Calcutta, there's a group of women who've come together. They call themselves Women Against Sexual Harassment, and they are organizing on campuses. So the hashtags have actually led to organizing on the ground by young women.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. That's the kind of sharing of information that we're looking forward to. Thank you.
Hi, just a question really. Men have never, held back on advising women what to do in times of problems. I'm just wondering whether in this case, women can advise men about how they can set up some role models for themselves, for younger men to follow, because I think there's a real area of probably confusion in younger men about what they're seeing, what they're hearing, and they probably need some support. So can the panel give some ideas about how maybe a role model, a male role model group could be set up?
I don't know if there's a male role model that we can set up, but I think it's a great idea, and you're absolutely right in saying that there's a lot of confusion and questioning also among young people, and I imagine among older people as well, which needs to be addressed, and I think really we need to have an open dialogue about it. And one of the things that this list has done is at least push people to talk about different kinds of issues.
I think the problem with role models is that they fall. Louis C.K., Aziz Ansari, these have all been the feminist role models in terms of feminist men. Like, they talked about the difficulties of being men. They talked about, in very honest and sometimes, too raw ways, but we looked at them and admired them because they were supposedly on our side. And now they're it's all into a very murky gray territory. So I think the concept of role model is not a good idea, because I think that we are all fallible as human beings. But I think what's more interesting is how parents talk to their sons and daughters, how in school, I mean, the whole idea, it's about gender, it's about gender equality, it's about saying that, is this behavior right, whether you're a boy or a girl? And this starts, way back. I don't think that makes any sense to put up some kind of role model and say, be like this person. I don't think it's worked.
Can I just also say that it's a little bit chicken and egg anyway. So as society evolves and we move towards where we need to go, won't those role models happen more naturally rather than trying to set them up at a time when people aren't exactly doing what they should or know what they should be doing in these situations? So as we move forward and people get educated in that further, men will become better role models for their sons and their grandsons and so on.
Ma'am, women are coming up with lists. We have made lists. We are being articulate about what's happening. But what is the problem that men, when we are putting up the list, the flip side comes that they may conspire to hire less women at workplaces. Obviously, nobody is coming out to say this, but this is what that's going on the male whisper network. So how are we going to deal with that?
I mean, aren't there laws in place about how many women a company has to have? No? I thought there was.
Only in the boardroom, and that is still not kept to. So.
It's a good
I was
question.
just going to say, in Iceland, it is illegal not to have a certain number of women.
Where?
In Iceland.
In Iceland.
So it's a tiny country and it's easy to do. I accept that. But perhaps we could, at some point, hope to get there. That's all I was...
Yeah, so we just have time for one last question.
This is a question to all of you. As far as I have read, research shows that children form a structure of the world about how they feel, what everything is around them by the age of 8. Now, when we talk of little girls, what do you think is the best way to get them ready for the kind of world that is out there? I know it is changing, we have discussed about it, but we also discussed that it goes real deep. So I as a child used to have a teacher who used to be a very loved teacher, a very respected one, but he used to molest children. He used to do it. So now, how do you get these girls ready to understand that while respect for a teacher is at one side of the table, there is also a list of things that he is not supposed to do? How do you get them ready for this?
Wow,
Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
That's such a difficult... I'm sorry we didn't really answer your question. I think the answer is that we don't know how one would try to keep an equality in the workplace. I was just having a strange thought about Bollywood films and how, in fact, having watched very few of them, but even watching them, I realized, and also Tamil films, because I live in Madras, where the whole idea of courtship is like the man pestering the woman. And I feel like maybe also popular culture can take some of the flack up on this and change the way that these things are portrayed, because, you know, it's not okay for somebody to constantly pester you. It's not okay. And even this thing of, you know, why didn't you just walk away, or why didn't she lead the... Because women are taught to just, you know, finally break down after a point and saying, okay, it's just easier for me to say yes at this point rather than, you know, being... this kind of resistant, because all our things around us are showing that. You start off saying no, then he sings like 2 or 3 songs, and then you're like, okay, I guess I love you too. That's not what love is, you know, that's not relationship, that's not how sex works between consenting adults.
No, I was just saying that stalking is a time-honored way of wooing, especially in these certain parts of the world. I was just going to answer your question because I have an 8-year-old daughter, and I think what we're doing today, what's happening on social media is in a way the key. So talk, keep talking to your little girls and your little boys, and don't give them different talks. Talk about the same things with both of them, and that's how we get past all these gendered problems.
If I could come back to your question, actually, I think it is true, and you pointed to a serious thing, that there is a backlash because of the ways in which issues are being raised. Many people are saying we will not employ women because they are the troublemakers. The fact of the matter is it's not women who are the troublemakers, it's the men who are the troublemakers, and it's the nature of the power relationships that exist in that space, which is by and large men holding the power and women not, that sort of enables this kind of thinking. I think there are many ways to address it, and which are beginning to happen also, not on a large enough scale. One of the things is for companies, corporates, employers to recognize a kind of contribution that women can make, and many companies are now doing that, and to cater for that. For example, simple things, you know, there is a Tata company, I don't know which one, but one that has created a workspace for women where women come to work from 2 o'clock to 8 o'clock. So they finish their household chores, then they come to work. So you recognize that their contribution is really important, but you enable it so that they can deal with the lives that they have. There are companies which are looking at women workers and saying, okay, the overalls that we create for workers have to be created with women in mind so that their efficiency is enabled. Otherwise, they're wearing these large loose things and gloves which don't fit them and hard hats that don't sit on their head, and they are working, and obviously their productivity will be much less. The recognition of what women's work can give, the importance of what women bring to the workplace, all of this has to be recognized. And that other question that you asked goes back to it, because you said, how can we prepare our girls for it? But actually, how can we prepare our boys for it? So in the workplace too, men have to be trained to understand that women are not objects for their taking or leaving or whatever they like, but rather that they are colleagues who are working. So all of this has to happen, and it has to start at the beginning. And I think we've begun in this tiny, tiny way to understand the problem, but we haven't done enough to address it, and meanwhile there is backlash, there's no doubt about it. And that's really tragic.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Tishani, Urvashi, and Shreya, for this wonderful session. I hope we've started in our tiny bits to engage with whatever lies ahead. And we'll end the session here, but let the discussions go on. Thank you.